Hello everybody, welcome back to part 2 of this week's session where we'll be finishing off on between participants ANOVA. So just to pick off where we left off, it was in the middle of analysing a two-way analysis of variance or looking at the output and thinking about its implications. So we had two non-significant main effects of status and of audience, our two IVs, but we had a significant interaction between them. So what this seems to suggest is that the effect of in-group status is significantly different at different levels of audience. Okay, now that is consistent with the hypothesis that there would be an interaction between status and audience, so that's good to an extent. But the prediction that we had was slightly more specific than that. It was that high versus low status would affect perceived conflict only in the out-group audience condition, not in the in-group audience condition. In other words, that interaction would have a specific form. Okay, so what we need to do to test that more specific prediction is to analyze the effective status at each level of the audience variable, remembering that the main effective status looks at the effective status collapsed across all levels of audience, whereas actually what we need to do is look at the effective status at each different level of audience. So to do this, we need to do just one additional step in our two-way ANOVA, and that is to conduct simple main effects analysis, or what sometimes is called simple effects analysis. Now what that does is test the main effect of one independent variable, status, at each different level of a second independent variable, or third or fourth independent variable. In this case, it's audience. Okay. So again, representing this schematically can help. So this was our, again, remember our two-way design, where we have the effective status broken down by audience condition, in-group versus out-group. And now what the simple main effects analysis does is it tests the effective status, high versus low, separately in the in-group audience condition and then again in the out-group audience condition. So it tests the effective status broken down at each level of audience. Okay, so let's go back to our analysis. So this is the analysis we had. Okay, so we have our main effects and our significant interaction. Now to run a simple main effects analysis, what we want to do is go down to simple effects, this drop down option set here. Okay. Now for conducting simple effects analyses or simple main effects analyses to decompose or to understand an interaction effect, it really helps to identify in your mind, perhaps on the basis of your theory or hypotheses, the focal independent variable and the moderator variable or moderator variables. So the moderator variable is the variable that you want to break the analysis down by. In this case, that's audience. Okay, and our main independent variable, our focal independent variable, is status. That's what we're interested in the effect of. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm specifying that I want to look at the simple effect of in-group status broken down at each level of the moderator, which is audience. Okay, now that's added this extra section to the Jamovi output. So let's go down and zoom in on that in the PowerPoint. So here's the output. So two things I've highlighted here. These are the means for the conditions. Okay, and these are the results of the simple main effects. And what that is showing fairly basically is that the simple main effect of status, the effective status, is not significant in the in-group audience condition. So there's our F, our numerator and denominator degrees of freedom, and our p-value. Okay, but it is significant in the out-group audience condition, in line with that prediction. So there's our F, our numerator and denominator degrees of freedom, and our p-value. Okay, so the effective status is significant in the out-group audience condition, but not in the in-group audience condition. Okay, and again, Jamovi also allows you in the plots option to graph that, and actually visually representing interaction effects can be very effective in communicating them to a reader. So here we have the effective status, low versus high, broken down by audience condition, in-group and out-group. And we can see here the steepness of this slope, okay, and the fact that this estimate is outside that confidence interval suggests that the effective status, the difference between the low and the high status condition, is significant in the out-group audience condition and not in the in-group audience condition. Okay. So let's add again a little bit more nuance or complexity to that design. Okay, so let's go back to that second hypothesis that we looked at, that group members will be less likely to perceive conflict with another group when their in-group has high or equal status relative to an out-group. So high or equal status versus having low status. So that was the design where status had 3 conditions rather than 2 conditions. And again, though, we have this caveat here, or this contingency effect. So this will only be the case when addressing, again, as we just seen, an out-group audience condition, an out-group audience rather than an in-group audience. So here again, we have 2 independent variables, status and audience. But this time, status is being operationalized as having 3 conditions, high, equal, and low, rather than 2 conditions. So it's a 2-way design, but this time it is a 3x2 design rather than a 2x2 design, which along the lines that we just saw. Okay, so 3 conditions and 2 conditions for audience. Again, schematically, what we're suggesting here is that the effective status won't be particularly apparent in the in-group audience condition, but it will be apparent in the out-group audience condition. Okay, so we'll see effects, specifically low, being different from the high and the equal conditions. Okay, so again, our analysis options here are 2-way analysis of variance. So let's have a look at that. Back to our second analysis, our second example data set. So linear models, general linear model. Okay, conflict is our DV, yet again. Status is our first IV and audience is our second IV. Okay. We will also want the simple effects because again it's hypothesizing or predicting an interaction. So we want the simple effects of in-group status broken down by audience. Okay. And we can do a couple of things here. We can do one extra thing. So we can already see from this output right at the bottom, it's giving us contrast between low and equal and equal and low, and the high and low conditions separately for in-group and out-group audience. Okay. In addition to the overall simple main effective status, it's giving us the pairwise comparisons within the status variable, again also broken down by audience condition. So these are simple pairwise conditions. Pairwise conditions for status, pairwise differences for status broken down at each level of audience. Okay, so you can keep that as it is, or again, as we saw a little bit earlier in the first part, we can change that coding of status to Helmert coding, and it will give us the contrast of the low condition versus the equal and high, again broken down by in-group audience and out-group audience conditions. Okay, so let's zoom in on the key parts of this back in the PowerPoint slides. All right, so this is the main ANOVA table. So what we have here, we have a significant main effective status. So it seems in this instance, the overall main effective status is significant. And the interaction is, not quite significant. P-value not quite significant at the 0.05 level. All right. Assuming we had already specified, as we did, that simple main effects were what we wanted to look at, we can still go ahead and have a look, with the big caveat that the interaction itself is not significant. Here we have the simple main effective status only significant in the out-group audience condition, not in the in-group audience condition. And the pairwise comparisons also suggest that the high and equal conditions were significantly different from the low status condition, but only again in the outgroup audience conditions. Okay, those are the p-values for each of those pairwise contrasts. And those are the pairwise contrasts, those same pairwise contrasts, non-significant in the in-group audience condition. Okay, so now that fact that the in-group status variable had more than two conditions has allowed us to dive that little bit further again, to drill down that little bit further again into the comparisons for status, broken down by, in simple terms, broken down by that second IV, different levels of audience. Okay, so yeah, when you have more than two conditions in one of your IVs, you can also look at simple pairwise comparisons as well as overall simple main effects. Again, a graph of that, again, not quite significant interaction effect, suggests, okay, there's the pattern. We have in the outgroup audience condition, the low status condition showing higher scores than the equal or the high status condition, okay, which isn't the case for the in-group audience condition. Now the key thing here is that even though that simple main effect, if I just go back, that simple main effect is significant in one audience condition but not in the other, that in itself is not evidence that these two effects differ. For that, you need to look at the interaction effect, which in this case is actually not quite significant. So even though it appears that the effect of status is significant here, but not here, the interaction effect, which is the actual test of the difference in strength between these two effects, that's suggesting, well, yeah, maybe they're not quite significantly different. Okay, even though one ends up, you know, on the right side of the significance threshold from the predictions point of view, and the other doesn't. Okay. So on to a final example. So what about designs that have more than two independent variables? So let's make our design, our operationalization, again, a little bit more complex. So let's take that basic hypothesis again. It's the same one we started out with. Group members will be less likely to perceive conflict with another group when their in-group has high status, only when addressing an out-group audience rather than an in-group audience. But now we have another layer of contingency. But this will only happen when perceived threat is low rather than high. So actually, maybe if we perceive that our group is under threat, we perceive high levels of conflict across the board. Okay, it doesn't depend on other things. But actually, in the relative safety of low threat, actually that's when we see these maybe slightly more strategic effects of status. Okay, so one way or another, what this is suggesting is a design with three independent variables, and we can operationalize those as having two conditions each in this case. So status has two conditions, high versus low. Audience has two conditions, in-group versus out-group, as we've already seen. But now we have a third independent variable, threat, which is operationalized as high versus low. And the hypothesis here is specifically suggesting that the effect of this first IV, status, as we've seen, will depend on that second independent variable, audience. But now it's also suggesting this is only going to occur at specific levels of this third independent variable, threat. So what that's suggesting analytically is we need to test the three-way interaction between the variables. Does the effect of our first IV depend on our second IV, audience, and in turn, is that only happening at levels of the third independent variable? Okay, again, schematic representation can really help. Here we have, again, the effect of high versus low status, but now it's also broken down by low and high threat. Okay, so over in the high threat condition, we're pretty much saying we're not probably going to see an effect of in-group status because perceptions of conflict are just going to be high across the board. When we feel threatened, we see tension, we see conflict. Okay, and actually we're only going to see that two-way interaction that we saw a little bit earlier. We're only going to see that in the low threat condition. Okay, so again, no effective status in the in-group audience condition, but there will be in the out-group audience condition. Okay. Right, analysis options here. Now, again, because we have 3 independent variables, we're looking at a 3-way analysis of variance. Now, a 3-way ANOVA will give you 7 effects. It'll give you the main effects of each of the 3 independent variables, collapsed across levels of the others, and it will give you the 3 possible 2-way interactions between the 3 IVs, so status by audience, status by threat, and audience by threat. Okay, and then finally it will give you the 3-way interaction between all 3 independent variables, and that's the one that tests whether the effect of status is different at different levels of audience, and in turn only at specific levels of threat. Okay, so let's see that in action. Over to a third data set here where we now have status and audience, but we also have threat coded as low and high. Okay. Again, under linear models, general linear model, conflict once more is our dependent variable. In-group status is our first IV, audience our second IV, and threat our third IV. Okay. In terms of simple effects, I want the effect of in-group status. Again, audience is the moderator, but now we have threat, which we can enter as what Jamovi calls a breaking variable, which is basically a second moderator. So I want to know, I'm asking here, I want to know the simple effects of status, in-group status, broken down at different levels of audience, but in turn please break this down at different levels of threat. And again, as is good practice for any of these analyses, ask for the estimated marginal means, a breakdown of the descriptive statistics. Okay. So that's our simple main effects summary, which I'll get to in a second. So the estimated marginal means here gives you a breakdown of means for the main effects, so of status, of audience, and of threat, of the 3 2-way interactions. So this is audience by status, status by threat, and audience by threat, and then this is the full breakdown of the means by each of the 8 possible combinations of status, audience, and threat. Okay, so just to zoom in on key aspects of the output here, so this is the ANOVA, the main ANOVA table. We have our 7 effects here, the 3 main effects, the 3 2-way interactions, and the 3-way interaction. And we can see here that actually none of the effects in the model are significant. Okay, so although the 3-way interaction is sort of getting there, it's not significant. Okay, at the 0.05 level. So let's nevertheless go ahead and look at the simple main effects analysis. So here is the breakdown of the effective status. This is the effective status broken down at each combination of audience and of threat. Okay, so this is the effective status in the in-group audience condition, in the low threat condition, for example. Now what we can see here is in those 4 combinations, the simple main effective status is indeed, actually, as the prediction might have suggested, only significant in the out-group audience condition when threat was low. Okay, this is the out-group audience condition when threat is low. F ratio, numerator, denominator degrees of freedom, and the p-value. In each of the other combinations of audience and threat, the effective status is not significant. Okay. Again, however, although that on the face of it is the pattern that's consistent with our hypothesis, the 3-way interaction that tests whether these simple effects are different from one another was not significant. So we cannot conclude that the effective status was different across these 4 combinations. Okay. Again, very helpful to break this down or sort of illustrate this using a figure. Okay. So this is very similar to what we've seen before, but now we have 2 panels. So we're breaking down the status by audience interaction by different levels of threat. This is the low threat combination, and this is the high threat combination. Okay. And we can see that although in the low threat condition, in the outgroup audience condition, the effective status, okay, this slope here, this is actually significant. It is not in turn significantly different from the effective status in the other three combinations. Okay, so that's it for between participants ANOVA. On the one hand, sort of putting it back into the context of how our between participant ANOVA options change and are affected by design decisions we might make, but also how to do it in Jamovi. Okay, and we're picking up some of the threads for analysing data from experimental designs next time when we look at how to analyse or analysis options when it comes to designs that have repeated measures aspects. Okay, thanks very much in the meantime. Take care, and yeah, see you next week.